Hello and welcome to Saddle Stories, where we delve into the captivating and often overlooked romantic narratives of the Old West. Are you ready to embark on a journey back in time, exploring tales of love, hardship, and resilience in the heart of the American frontier? If you enjoy stories about the Wild West, why don't you consider subscribing to this channel? Our tale begins in Dust Creek, Wyoming Territory, winter of 1874. A time and place where life was as unforgiving as the landscape itself. Snow clung precariously to the windows of the Dust Creek Saloon, an old, weathered structure, its timbers groaning under the relentless assault of the wind. The howl of the wind seeped through the cracks, a constant reminder of the bitter cold outside. Inside the saloon, a stark contrast existed. The air hung thick and heavy, a potent cocktail of pipe smoke, the acrid tang of cheap whiskey, and the boisterous laughter of men who'd clearly been indulging since the early hours of the day. Scattered across the room were card tables, their surfaces worn smooth and scarred by years of countless bets gone wrong and promises carelessly broken. At a far corner table, a man named Thomas Ray sat hunched over his cards, his face flushed a fiery red from the relentless flow of liquor. His shirt collar hung open, the buttons straining, and his hands trembled ever so slightly as he tossed yet another losing hand onto the growing pile of discards. The stack of coins that had once sat before him, a symbol of hope and fortune, had vanished hours ago, swallowed up by the insatiable greed of the game. His revolver, a man's most trusted companion in those days, had followed suit a few hands later, leaving him with nothing but a desperate gamble. Do you like this story? I'm sure you will. To hear more of the stories, please subscribe. The dealer, a man with eyes as cold as the winter wind outside, leaned back in his chair, a crooked grin slicing across his face like a jagged scar. "Well, Ray," he drawled, his voice laced with a mixture of amusement and contempt. "Looks like you've run dry. Got anything left worth putting on the table? Anything at all?" Thomas swallowed hard, the muscles in his jaw twitching nervously. His eyes darted around the table, searching for any glimmer of hope, any forgotten possession he could use as leverage. But there was nothing. His gaze then shifted, almost involuntarily, to a figure standing quietly in the corner of the room. Abby stood there, her back ramrod straight, but her head bowed in quiet resignation. Her dark hair was tucked neatly into a faded shawl, a garment that had clearly seen better days. Her cheeks were pale, almost translucent, and her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding onto some last vestige of hope. A cruel sneer curled at the edge of Thomas's mouth as he looked upon her. "For years," he announced, his voice loud enough to carry through the smoke-filled saloon, drawing the attention of nearly everyone present. "For damn years, and she hasn't given me a single child. Not one. Useless as an old mule." A wave of low, guttural chuckles rippled through the room, but Thomas leaned forward, his voice cutting through the haze of smoke and laughter with a sharper edge. "I'll trade her," he declared, "for a sack of corn." The laughter intensified, turning sharp and cruel, echoing off the rough-hewn walls of the saloon. One man slapped the table and wheezed with amusement, while another raised his glass in a mock salute, a grotesque parody of respect. Abby's stomach knotted with shame, heat rising in her face despite the bone-chilling cold that seeped through the floorboards. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the ground, willing herself not to cry, not here, not in front of these men. From a shadowed corner near the back wall, a deep voice spoke, calm but carrying over the cacophony of noise. "I'll take her." A hush fell over the room, heads turning in unison toward the source of the unexpected declaration. Silas Ward stood slowly, pushing his chair back with a deliberate quietness that drew all eyes on him. He was taller than most of the men in the saloon, broad-shouldered and lean, with weathered hands that spoke of hard work and a life lived outdoors. His eyes were the color of storm clouds, holding a quiet intensity that seemed to penetrate the smoke and shadows. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door, disappearing briefly into the frigid night. In moments, he returned, carrying a burlap sack heavy with golden corn. "Now this is an interesting development, isn't it?" Before the plot thickens, don't forget to like and subscribe." He set the sack down on the table with a solid thump that rattled the glasses and silenced the remaining laughter. "That should cover it," he said simply, his gaze unwavering. Thomas gave a short, bitter laugh, devoid of any real humor. "She's all yours, Ward," he said, waving his hand dismissively. Silas didn't even glance at Thomas. Instead, he turned his gaze toward Abby. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes were steady, holding hers for the first time that night. In that moment, it seemed as though the entire saloon faded away, leaving only the two of them. He extended his hand, not grabbing or pulling, just holding it out, palm open in a gesture of offering. For a heartbeat, Abby didn't move, her mind reeling from the sudden turn of events. The saloon felt smaller now, the smell of whiskey and sweat pressing in around her, suffocating her with the weight of her past. Then, she let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, and stepped forward. Her fingers brushed against his, and he closed his hand around hers, not tight or possessive, but firm enough to offer guidance and support as he led her through the crowded saloon. They walked toward the door, their boots thudding against the wooden floorboards. Behind them, the men's laughter rose again, mingled with jeers and muttered jokes, a cruel chorus to her departure. Silas pushed the door open, letting in a rush of icy wind that cut through the stifling air inside. He guided Abby outside without looking back, the heavy door swinging shut behind them, cutting off the sound of the saloon and the harsh reality of her past. The cold hit her cheeks like a slap, but the air was clean and sharp, a stark contrast to the stench of smoke and despair that permeated the saloon. For the first time that night, Abby lifted her head and looked around. The snow fell in slow, silent flakes, covering the muddy street and the rooftops beyond in a pristine blanket of white. Silas still held her hand as they stepped away from the saloon's lamplight and into the darkness. The night outside the Dust Creek Saloon was a wall of cold, the kind that crept into a man's bones and stayed there for days. Snow crunched under Silas Ward's boots as he led Abby toward the hitching post, where his bay gelding waited patiently, steam curling from the animal's nostrils in the frigid air. He didn't rush her, but his stride was steady and purposeful, as though he was determined to leave this town behind as quickly as possible. He let go of her hand only to untie the reins. He then pulled a thick wool saddle blanket from his pack, shaking it out in the still night air to remove any accumulated snow. "Up you go," he said quietly, his voice low and reassuring. Abby hesitated, her fingers stiff from the cold. The thought of climbing onto a stranger's horse, and entering a stranger's life, made her chest tighten with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Still, she reached for the pommel. Silas steadied the saddle with one hand and braced her elbow with the other, helping her mount without pulling her closer than necessary. Once she was seated, he reached into a saddlebag and drew out a heavy sheepskin cloak. Without asking, he stepped beside her and draped it over her shoulders, his movements gentle and respectful. "You're cold," he said, his voice low, more a statement of fact than a question. The cloak smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke, a comforting scent that reminded her of hearth fires and home. She pulled it tighter around her, grateful for its warmth. Silas mounted in front of her. He didn't tell her to hold on, but when the horse moved, she gripped the edge of the saddle behind him, her hands clenched tightly instead of touching his coat. Dust Creek streets were nearly empty, save for a lone lantern swinging outside the general store and the dim glow emanating from the undertaker's window. This is a Western movie, with people trying to build a community. Have you thought about joining our community, by subscribing, too? The gelding's hooves rang against the frozen ground, their sound muffled now and then by patches of snow. Beyond the town limits, only the creak of leather, the steady rhythm of hooves, and the whisper of wind through the bare cottonwood trees filled the air. The land stretched wide and white under the pale moonlight, a vast expanse of snow-covered fields broken only by the dark lines of fence posts and low, distant hills. Abby's breath rose in pale clouds, disappearing into the cold night. She wondered if she should speak, break the silence that hung between them, but her voice felt locked away, trapped by years of unspoken words. Silas gave no sign that he expected conversation, his gaze fixed on the trail ahead. Now and then, he shifted slightly, glancing at the trail ahead, the brim of his hat shadowing his eyes. His silence was not the heavy, dangerous kind she had known with Thomas, full of judgment and the constant threat of sudden anger. It was something quieter, something deeper, more akin to a man who spoke only when it truly mattered. They rode on for what felt like hours, the snow deepening with each passing mile, crunching softly under the gelding's hooves. The wind picked up, whistling softly in her ears, a mournful melody that echoed the uncertainty in her heart. Then, as they crested a small rise, Abby saw it, a warm flicker of light in the distance. The light grew stronger with each step, resolving into the steady glow of oil lamps, shining from the windows of a large, sturdy ranch house. The roof pitched steep against the winter snow, its walls built from heavy pine logs, darkened by years of exposure to the elements. Smoke curled lazily from the stone chimney, carrying the comforting scent of burning oak. Silas slowed the horse to a walk as they entered the yard. The crunch of snow under the gelding's hooves was joined by the low moo of a cow from the barn and the shuffle of hooves inside the corral. A split-rail fence framed the main house, and beside it stood a smaller bunkhouse, its door shut tight against the cold. Before the gelding came to a complete stop, the front door swung open. A boy of about 12 ran out, followed by another, a little younger, and a small girl bundled in a knitted scarf that hid half her face. They halted at the porch steps, their eyes wide with curiosity, their breath puffing out in the cold air. "Evening," Silas said, dismounting with practiced ease. He reached up to take Abby's hand, steadying her as she stepped down. "This is Abby," he said simply, his deep voice carrying in the still night air. "From now on, she stays here." The older boy's gaze flicked between them, curious but without fear. The girl tilted her head, her scarf slipping enough to reveal a shy smile. Silas took the gelding's reins and started toward the barn, the children stepping aside to let him pass. Abby stood for a moment, the lamplight from the open doorway spilling across the snow at her feet. That is what makes westerns fun to watch. Do you agree? If you do, why not consider subscribing to hear more? Then the little girl reached out and tugged gently at her hand, as if inviting her inside. Abby followed, the warmth from within brushing against her chilled skin as she crossed the threshold. Outside, Silas's boots crunched away toward the barn, his movements as steady and certain as the man himself. The warmth of the ranch house wrapped around Abby like a heavy quilt the moment she stepped inside. The smell hit her first, rich and savory, with a hint of spice that made her mouth water. Her stomach tightened, not in hunger exactly, but in the memory of how long it had been since she'd smelled food like this. The little girl still held her hand, tugging her toward a long wooden table near the hearth. A cast-iron pot bubbled merrily on the stove, sending curls of steam into the lamplight. The older boy fetched bowls from a shelf, while the younger dragged a chair closer to the table, his face alight with curiosity. Silas entered a moment later, shutting the door firmly against the wind. He hung his coat, crossed to the stove, and lifted the heavy lid of the pot. The scent deepened, revealing a hearty beef stew thick with potatoes, carrots, and onions. He inhaled deeply, then reached for the ladle. Abby sat where the girl indicated, her hands folded demurely in her lap. She watched Silas fill the bowls, handing them first to the children. He set one in front of her last, sliding it toward her with a quiet, "Here." She picked up the spoon, the heat from the stew warming her cold fingers. The first bite was almost overwhelming, tender beef, soft vegetables, broth so rich she could taste the hours it had simmered. She had eaten stew before, but not like this, not in years. Fresh bread sat in the center of the table, steam rising from its torn crust. She hesitated, unsure whether she should take some, until the younger boy grinned and pushed the basket toward her. "Take some," he said warmly, his eyes full of genuine kindness. The bread was warm against her palm, the crust crisp, the inside soft enough to soak up the broth. She closed her eyes briefly as she chewed, letting the simple pleasure settle inside her. The children talked as they ate, their chatter filling the room with the details of their day: the colt born last spring, the snowdrifts piled high by the barn wall, the fox tracks they had seen near the chicken coop. Their voices overlapped in an easy, familiar rhythm. Silas listened more than he spoke, his gaze shifting from one child to another, his eyes full of quiet affection. When Abby's cup was nearly empty, he reached for the teapot and poured more before filling his own. It was a small thing, a simple act of courtesy, but it struck her with quiet force. No man had ever served her before, not without expecting something in return. Do you find the characters likable? Subscribe to the channel to learn more about what will happen to them. When the meal was done, the older boy carried the bowls to the sink. The younger two darted off to the hearth, where a pile of wooden toys waited. Silas stood and motioned for her to follow. He led her down a short hallway to a room at the end. It was small but tidy, a narrow bed neatly made, a chest at its foot, and a single window looking out toward the barn. The quilt was patched but clean, its colors faded by years of washing. Silas stepped inside, crossed to the nightstand, and set a small brass key on top. "You can lock the door from the inside," he said, "if you want to." Abby looked from the key to his face, searching for any hint of mockery or hidden condition. There was none. His voice carried no expectation, only a simple statement of fact. "You want the lamp left burning?" he asked, his voice low and gentle. She shook her head slowly. "No, thank you." He gave a single nod, stepped back into the hallway, and pulled the door halfway closed. "Good night, Abby," he said softly. "Good night," she murmured, the word feeling strange and unfamiliar after so many nights spent in silence. When the door clicked shut, she sat on the bed, her gaze fixed on the key. She picked it up, the cool metal heavy in her palm. It wasn't the lock itself that mattered, she realized. It was the choice, the simple act of offering her a sense of control and security in a world where she had none. For the first time in years, she had been given one. She placed the key back on the nightstand, lay down, and pulled the quilt over her shoulders. The smell of clean cotton and wood smoke surrounded her, a comforting embrace that eased the tension in her body. Outside, the wind swept across the snowfields, a constant reminder of the harsh world beyond the walls of the ranch house. But in here, it was warm, quiet, and most surprising of all, safe. Do you think this safety will last? Subscribe to find out. The wind had been cruel all morning, sweeping across the open fields with a fine dusting of snow that stung the skin. Abby hauled buckets of water from the pump near the barn, her breath turning to clouds in the frigid air. She balanced the heavy wooden handle across her shoulders, the icy water sloshing with each step. The packed snow was slick, treacherous underfoot. She took one careful step toward the porch, then another, until her heel caught on a hidden patch of ice. The buckets pulled her sideways, sending her crashing to her knees. One of the buckets struck a jagged piece of frozen wood, and a sharp pain shot through her leg. The buckets tipped, spilling the water in a dark stain over the snow. Pulling back her skirt, she saw blood seeping through the wool of her stocking. The porch creaked, the sound amplified in the stillness of the morning. Silas's boots crunched toward her, his steps quick and concerned. He crouched beside her, his face calm but intent. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low with concern. She nodded, though the cold bit at her exposed skin. "Let's get you inside before it freezes worse," he said without waiting for a protest. He slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees. She stiffened, instinctively resisting the touch, but his hold was steady and sure as he carried her to the porch. Inside, he set her gently in a chair near the stove, where the fire's warmth quickly flushed her cheeks. From a shelf, he took a battered wooden box with brass hinges and set it beside her. Opening it, he revealed clean cloths, a tin of salve, and a fresh bandage. Kneeling before her, he met her gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet concern. "I need to see the cut," he said gently. "May I?" She stared at him, her mind reeling from the unexpected gesture. No one had ever asked her permission not to touch, not to tend to her wounds, not for anything. Her voice barely above a whisper. He drew her skirt back just enough to roll down the stocking, revealing the gash. Gently, he cleaned the wound, his touch light and careful. The salve was cool and soothing under his fingers. When he was finished, he wrapped the cut in a clean cloth. "Keep it dry for a day or two," he said quietly. "It should heal just fine." She nodded, unable to meet his eyes, afraid he'd see how deeply the moment had unsettled her, how profoundly his simple act of kindness had affected her. A few days later, the house was warm with the smell of cinnamon and wood smoke. The children had decided it was a good day for baking. Lucy tugged at Abby's sleeve, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "Come on," she said, pulling her toward the kitchen. "We're making biscuits." Abby let herself be led into the kitchen, where the boys were already at the table, sleeves rolled up, measuring flour with varying degrees of accuracy. Silas stood at the counter, cutting butter into thick cubes. She hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether she should intrude, until Lucy pressed a wooden spoon into her hand and pointed at a bowl filled with flour. "Stir," she commanded, her voice full of childish authority. Abby laughed, a sound she barely recognized, and began to mix. Flour puffed up in a white cloud, dusting her hands and arms. One of the boys leaned too close, knocking his elbow into the bowl and spilling more flour across the table. "Careful there," Silas said, though his voice held no sternness. He reached over to add the butter, his sleeve brushing Abby's lightly. They worked together, rolling out the dough and cutting circles with the rim of a tin cup. Lucy leaned on the counter, her cheeks flushed with excitement, chattering endlessly about their plans for the day. When Abby bent to place the biscuits on a pan, a handful of flour landed squarely on her head, a white crown of culinary mishap. She looked up to see the younger boy grinning, his hands dusted white. "Oh, you think that's funny?" she asked, feigning outrage, then flicked a pinch of flour back at him. He yelped with laughter. The older boy joined in the flour fight, and somehow Silas ended up with a streak of flour along his jaw. He paused, a faint smile playing on his lips, then tapped a pinch lightly onto Abby's shoulder. The room filled with laughter, free and unguarded. Abby felt her cheeks ache from smiling, a sensation that was both unfamiliar and incredibly welcome. She glanced at Silas, and she saw that he was watching her, not just with amusement, but with a quiet warmth that made something shift deep inside her. By the time the biscuits were in the oven and the table wiped clean, her hair and shoulders were dusted white, and Silas had a pale smear on his hat brim. It was ridiculous, messy, and perfect. Have you enjoyed the content on this channel? If you have, why don't you subscribe to hear more about the adventures on the frontier? It had been years since she'd laughed in a kitchen, years since she'd felt part of something that wasn't built on fear or obligation. Standing there with the smell of baking bread filling the air, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the easy companionship of the children, she knew that something in her life had already begun to change, slowly but inexorably. Morning broke clear and sharp, the sky a pale blue stretched taut over the snowfields. The wind had quieted after a night of rattling windows, leaving the air so still that every sound carried far, the distant low moo of cattle, the creak of barn doors, the crunch of boots on packed snow. Abby had gone out early to check the chicken coop, her breath hanging like smoke in the frigid air. She carried a small pail of feed, her boots leaving crisp impressions in the snow as she walked. The yard was quiet, the ranch slowly stirring to life. Silas and the boys were near the barn, their voices faint but familiar. She had grown used to the rhythm of life here, the work that filled her days, the warmth that awaited her each evening. Still, part of her moved cautiously, as though walking on thin ice, afraid that the fragile peace she had found would shatter at any moment. After scattering the feed, she wandered toward the main gate, drawn by an unseen force. The snow there lay untouched, a clean sweep of white stretching to the split-rail fence that marked the ranch boundary. The gate stood tall and weathered, its timbers worn smooth by countless Wyoming winters. Then she saw it, something new. Hanging from the crossbeam was a fresh wooden sign, the letters carved deep and clean. Ward Ranch, Silas and Abigail Ward. She stopped, frozen in place. Her eyes traced the letters again and again, certain that she must be reading them wrong, that her mind was playing tricks on her. But there it was, her name cut into the wood as surely as the snow lay under her boots. Her hand lifted, almost involuntarily, her fingertips brushing the grooves of the carved letters. The edges caught faintly under her touch, the wood still slightly rough. The smell of freshly cut pine lingered in the air. A memory struck, sharp and painful. Standing in the corner of the Dust Creek Saloon, listening to her husband's voice ringing out as he traded her for a sack of corn. The laughter, the heat of shame, the utter humiliation. And now, here was her name, etched into this sign beside Silas's, not tacked on as an afterthought, not hidden in someone else's shadow, but a permanent part of the ranch itself. Her throat tightened, the cold stinging her eyes. Footsteps crunched behind her, breaking the spell. Silas came to stand beside her, his hat low against the morning sun. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply looking at the sign with her, sharing the moment in silence. "Why did you do this?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "I did," he replied, his gaze unwavering. "Why?" The word caught in her throat, not from doubt, but from the aching need to understand, to truly believe that this was real. "Because this is your home," he said simply. "You belong here." The words resonated deep within her, striking a chord that had long been silent. She had been a daughter told to stay quiet, a wife whose worth was measured by the children she could not give. And now, a man had placed her name beside his, not out of debt or pity, but out of choice, out of a genuine belief that she belonged. The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine from the newly carved sign. She thought of the nights spent by the fire, surrounded by the laughter of children, of Silas's quiet strength and unwavering kindness, of the way he always asked before touching her. Her fingers rested on the carved letters again, tracing their shape with a newfound sense of ownership. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Silas nodded once, as if that was all there was to say, as if the gesture spoke for itself. Then, he turned toward the barn, his movements as practical and purposeful as ever. "Come on," he said. "The cattle won't wait." She watched him walk away, his strides leaving clear tracks in the snow. The sign hung behind her, the morning light making the letters glow against the pale wood. She took one last look, then followed him, her heart lighter than it had been in years. The cold still bit at her cheeks, but deep inside, there was a warmth that had nothing to do with the winter sun. If you've enjoyed this glimpse into the lives of Abigail and Silas, and if you're eager to uncover more stories of the untamed West, then be sure to like this video and subscribe to Saddle Stories. There are so many untold adventures waiting just around the corner.